I remember the way the glass felt cold against my scalp before I even understood what was happening. One moment, I was trying to pass the bowl of roasted potatoes across the table, and the next, water was dripping down my face, soaking through my blouse, sliding into the collar of my sweater. My fork clattered onto the plate as I gasped. Cassidy's hand was steady, her voice sharper than I had ever heard it. "You've got 5 minutes to get out of my house." The words didn't register at first. I just stared at her, blinking water out of my eyes, waiting for some kind of punchline. But there wasn't one. She sat there, shoulders squared, glaring at me like I was a stranger who had broken in rather than her own sister sitting at the family table. No one moved. My parents froze mid-bite, forks hanging in the air, their eyes bouncing between us. Graham, her husband, lowered his glass slowly, but he didn't say a word. The silence pressed against my ears, heavier than the water dripping down into my lap. "Cassidy," I whispered, my voice unsteady. "What are you doing?" She didn't answer. She just pointed toward the front door. Her jaw was locked so tight I could see the muscles quivering. I looked around the table, hoping, begging, for someone to speak up, to break the tension, to remind her that this was supposed to be dinner, not war. But no one did. My mother dropped her gaze to her plate. My father cleared his throat, but kept his mouth shut. Graham rubbed at his chin, eyes fixed firmly on the tablecloth. I could feel my cheeks burning hotter than the soup that still sat untouched in front of me. My chest tightened, and I had to swallow hard against the lump rising in my throat. Part of me wanted to argue, to demand an explanation, but my voice felt trapped somewhere deep in my chest. "Fine," I said finally, barely more than a whisper. My chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor as I pushed back. The sound seemed to jolt everyone, but still no one tried to stop me. Not a single hand reached out. I could feel my clothes clinging to my skin as I stood, heavy with water. The room smelled of garlic bread and rosemary, but all I could taste was the metallic tang of humiliation. My hands shook as I grabbed my coat off the back of the chair. Cassidy didn't look at me again. She sat perfectly still, one arm wrapped across her chest, the other resting on the table as if nothing had happened. My parents still wouldn't meet my eyes. With each step toward the door, I waited for someone to call out, for someone to say, "Stop, sit down, let's talk about this." But the words never came. When I finally reached the door, I hesitated, my hand on the knob, giving them one last chance. Nothing, just the scrape of a fork against a plate. So I walked out, water dripping from my hair onto the porch, into the night air that suddenly felt sharper than it should. And behind me, the door closed with a click that echoed louder than Cassidy's word. The night air bit at my skin as I hurried down the front steps, my clothes clinging cold and heavy. Each step felt clumsy, like I was moving through mud. My hair dripped onto my shoulders, sliding down my back. I didn't even care where I was going. I just needed to get away from that house, away from the table where silence had spoken louder than any words. I fumbled with my car keys, my hands trembling so badly that I dropped them twice before finally getting the door unlocked. I slid into the seat, water soaking into the fabric beneath me, and just sat there staring at the steering wheel. My chest rose and fell fast, my throat burning like I'd swallowed fire. I kept waiting for the door to open, for someone to follow me out, but the porch light stayed still. The door never moved. The longer I sat, the clearer it became. No one was coming. My parents had just sat there, pretending their forks and plates were more important than. Graham hadn't even looked me in the eye. The shame I felt at that table had cut deep, but this quiet abandonment sank even deeper. I turned the key in the ignition and drove, the wipers pushing streaks of water across the glass. Streetlights blurred as tears mixed with the water on my cheeks. I kept hearing her voice, sharp and final. 5 minutes to get out. Not a fight, not a misunderstanding, an eviction from her life. By the time I reached the small apartment I rented on the edge of town, my anger was tangled with something heavier. It wasn't just about dinner. The pieces started to click together in the silence of my car as I sat outside the building. Cassidy's glare, the tightness in her jaw, the way our parents avoided my eyes, it wasn't sudden. It had been building for years. I thought back to holidays where she rolled her eyes if I got a compliment. Birthdays where she gave gifts that felt more like obligations than gestures of love. Times she'd made cutting remarks and brushed them off as jokes. Little things that I had ignored, telling myself I was imagining it. Tonight, all of it had boiled over. Cassidy had never truly let go of the grudges she carried. Maybe it was jealousy, maybe resentment, maybe something she could never put into words. But tonight proved one thing. She had been waiting for the right moment to strike, and she didn't care who got hurt in the process. Sitting there in the dark car, water pooling on the seat beneath me, I finally understood. That dinner wasn't the beginning of a fight. It was the end of whatever bond we had left. The sister I grew up with, the one I used to share secrets with under the covers, was gone. What sat at that table tonight was someone else. Someone who had been carrying her bitterness like a weapon, waiting for the chance to use it. And she had used it on me. When I was younger, I never noticed the way Cassidy's eyes followed me whenever Grandma reached for my hand. To me, it was natural. I was the quiet one, the one who sat still long enough to listen to Grandma's long stories about her childhood or learn the old recipes she kept tucked in a faded notebook. Cassidy was restless, always chasing friends, always moving. Grandma would smile at her too, but when it came to sharing secrets or long afternoons, it was me she turned to. At the time, I didn't think it meant anything. I thought Cassidy didn't care about that sort of closeness. But even as children, little cracks started forming. She would make small remarks like, "Of course Grandma picked you," whenever I was asked to help bake cookies or decorate the tree. I laughed it off, thinking she was joking, but there was always a sting behind her words. When Grandma passed away, the divide grew wider. She left me a small savings account and a jewelry box filled with keepsakes, an old locket with a faded photograph, a pearl ring, and a quilt she had stitched by hand. None of it was extravagant, but it meant everything to me. To Cassidy, it was proof. Proof that Grandma had loved me more, that I had been chosen in a way she never was. I tried to share some of it with her. I offered to let her keep the quilt since she had spent nights under it too, when storms rattled the windows and we both ran to Grandma's bed. She refused, her lips pressed tight, saying, "I don't want your charity." After that, I stopped trying. Our parents never helped bridge the gap. If anything, they made it worse without realizing. They'd praise me for being patient, for helping Grandma during her last months, for remembering to call her every weekend. Cassidy would sit at the table, arms crossed, staring at her plate. They thought she didn't care, but I could see in her silence that she did. Years passed, and I convinced myself time had softened. Cassidy got married, bought a house, started hosting family dinners. I thought those old resentments had faded into the background. She smiled in pictures, she hugged me at gatherings, she spoke politely enough. I let myself believe that we had grown past the old rivalry, but in truth, it had never disappeared. It had been simmering quietly, like a pot left on low heat, bubbling just enough to keep alive. Every holiday where I wore Grandma's locket, every time our parents mentioned how thoughtful I was, every reminder that Grandma had left me something she hadn't, it all piled up. Sitting in my car after that disastrous dinner, I could see it clearly for the first time. The water she poured on me wasn't about the meal or some sudden temper. It was the weight of years, the bitterness she had carried since childhood, finally spilling over. I thought we had moved forward. She had been standing still, holding on to every slight she thought she suffered, until finally she let it out in the cruelest way possible. It was a week after that dinner when the missing piece finally fell into place. I hadn't spoken to Cassidy, hadn't heard a single word from my parents either. The silence from them all felt heavier than the moment I'd walked out dripping wet. Then my aunt, our mother's younger sister, called me out of the blue. Her voice was calm at first, asking how I was, but I could hear something tight underneath, like she had been holding on to something she needed to let out. She hesitated before saying it, but when the words came, they landed like stones in my chest. Cassidy had gone digging through old papers after Grandma died. She had found a copy of the will that showed the truth. What Grandma left me wasn't just the jewelry and the savings account I had known about. There had been more. Some bonds tucked away, a small parcel of land on the edge of town, things our parents had kept quiet to avoid tension. I hadn't known either, not until my aunt told me. Cassidy knew, though. She had known for months. And in her eyes, it was all proof of betrayal. Proof that Grandma had loved me more, trusted me more, and left her with nothing but scraps. She hadn't seen the years I spent at Grandma's side, the hours of care and company. She only saw numbers, property, and what she believed she was owed. "She feels cheated," my aunt said softly. "She told me herself, Marin. She said she can't stand to look at you, knowing you got more. That dinner, it wasn't just about anger. She wanted to make sure you knew she was done with you." I sat there with the phone pressed against my ear, my stomach twisting. So that was it. Not a fight that spiraled out of control, not a sudden outburst. It had been planned, in her own cold way. She didn't confront me, didn't sit down to tell me how she felt. She chose to humiliate me in front of everyone, to pour water on my head and shove me out like I was dirt under her shoes. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible. It wasn't only about the inheritance, it was about trust. All those dinners, all those polite smiles, all the times she hugged me goodnight while secretly holding this grudge, every one of them felt poisoned now. She hadn't wanted to fix things. She had been waiting for a chance to strike. When I hung up the phone, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I walked around my small apartment, staring at the few things I had of Grandma's, the locket on the dresser, the quilt folded neatly at the end of my bed. They had always felt like comfort. Now they felt heavy, like a chain around my neck, dragging me into a fight I hadn't even known I was in. Cassidy hadn't just pushed me out of her house. She had pushed me out of her life, convinced herself that revenge was worth more than family. And worst of all, she had made sure the wound was public, so I could never forget the sting of being cast aside in front of everyone who mattered. The morning after my aunt's call, I sat at the kitchen table of my small apartment with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand. My mind kept circling back to the same thought. Cassidy had wanted me gone. She had made that clear in every possible way. And as much as it hurt, I realized there was nothing left for me to hold on to. I could have argued. I could have marched back to her house, demanded she face me, demanded she explain herself. But what good would that do? She had already made her choice. She had chosen resentment over sisterhood, humiliation over honesty. I decided then that I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of watching me break. If she wanted me out of her life, I would give her exactly what she wanted. So I threw myself into building a new routine. I picked up extra hours at work, coming home exhausted but grateful for the distraction. My apartment was small, just a one-bedroom with creaky floors and thin walls, but it was mine. I kept it tidy, filling the space with things that brought me comfort. A few second-hand bookshelves, a lamp with a warm glow, and the quilt Grandma had left me, folded neatly on the couch. There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene at the dinner table. The sound of water splashing against my skin, her voice sharp and cold, the silence that followed. The memory always burned, but I let it fuel me. I promised myself I wouldn't beg for their approval or chase after people who had turned their backs on me. My parents didn't call. Neither did Graham. At first, that silence cut deeper than anything Cassidy had done, but in time, it hardened me. I told myself if they wanted to side with her, they could stay there. I would build a life without them. Work became my anchor. I showed up early, stayed late, saved every dollar I could. I packed lunches, skipped dinners out, and kept my head down. Each paycheck felt like a small step toward stability, a reminder that I could stand on my own. On weekends, I walked through the small farmer's market near my apartment, picking out fresh bread and vegetables. I found comfort in the ordinary routines of strangers, the way the baker always smiled, the way children tugged at their parents' sleeves for cookies. It reminded me that life moved on, even when families fractured. And through it all, I carried one vow quietly inside me. I would never forget what Cassidy had done. I wouldn't seek her out, wouldn't try to mend something she had broken with her own hand. But I also wouldn't forgive. Some wounds ran too deep for forgiveness. I chose silence not because I was weak, but because it was the only way to keep my dignity. If she wanted me erased, I would erase myself from her world. But one day, when she looked back, she would realize what she had thrown away. And that knowledge would be her burden to carry, not mine. Months slipped by quietly. I kept my head down, focused on work, and tried not to think too much about Cassidy or the rest of the family. Life was steady, not glamorous, but it was mine. I thought I had finally reached a point where the sting of that dinner had dulled into something I could carry without wincing. Then one afternoon, everything shifted. It started with a chance encounter. I was leaving the grocery store, a paper bag balanced against my hip, when I saw Graham standing by the parking lot. He looked different, thinner, worn down. His shirt hung loose, his hair unkempt, and there was a tired slump in his shoulders. He spotted me before I could duck away. "Marin," he said, forcing a smile. It didn't reach his eyes. I gave a short nod, unsure whether to walk past or stop. We hadn't spoken since the night of the dinner. He had sat there, silent as stone, while his wife threw me out. "How have you been?" he asked, his voice low, like he was afraid of being overheard. "Fine," I said simply. "Busy with work." He shifted from foot to foot, then finally blurted, "Could we talk? Just for a few minutes." I should have refused, but curiosity got the better of me. We found a quiet corner near the edge of the lot. Graham rubbed at his hands, glancing around nervously before speaking. "Cassidy doesn't know I'm talking to you. Things haven't been good at home." I stayed silent, waiting. He took a deep breath. "I made some bad investments. Real estate, stocks, stuff I thought would pay off, but it didn't. We're in debt. More than I can handle. And Cassidy, she keeps spending like nothing's wrong. She cares too much about how people see us. The house, the cars, the parties. It's all too much, Marin. We're drowning." I tightened my grip on the grocery bag, unsure where this was leading. Finally, he looked me straight in the eye. "I heard from your aunt about Grandma's estate, that there was more left to you than you might even know. Cassidy thinks you're sitting on money that could help us. I need to know if that's true." The weight of his words settled heavy in my chest. So that was it. Not concern, not guilt, not even an apology for what had happened months ago. He was here because they wanted something from me. For a moment, anger flared hot. After everything Cassidy had done, after humiliating me and cutting me out, now they wanted to come crawling back because their perfect life was crumbling. But I didn't show it. I kept my face calm, my voice steady. "I don't know what you've heard," I said slowly, "but Grandma left me what she wanted to leave me. Nothing more, nothing less." Graham nodded, though disappointment clouded his face. He muttered something about figuring things out and walked away, his shoulders sagging. As I watched him leave, one thought burned clear in my mind. I hadn't gone looking for revenge, but maybe it had just walked straight to me. Not long after that meeting in the parking lot, the phone calls began. At first, it was Graham, his voice calm and careful, asking if we could meet for coffee. He spoke about options, about working together as a family. Soon enough, Cassidy's number started showing up too. Her tone was smoother than I expected, polite in a way that almost sounded rehearsed. She never mentioned the dinner, never apologized, never acknowledged what she had done. Instead, she talked about family sticking together and how Grandma wouldn't want us divided. I knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't reaching out to mend anything. They wanted what I had. The inheritance, the heirlooms, anything they thought could pull them out of the hole they had dug. At first, anger surged through me, but I forced it down. If they thought I would roll over, they were wrong. I decided to play along. I softened my voice when I answered their calls, nodded when they spoke as if I agreed, and let them believe I was unsure, even guilty. I wanted them comfortable, wanted them to show me exactly how far they would go. One afternoon, Cassidy invited me to her house. I almost laughed at the irony of stepping back into the place where she had thrown me out. This time, I walked in dry, calm, and sharp-eyed. She greeted me with a smile that didn't touch her eyes and poured tea like nothing had ever happened. "Marin," she said sweetly, "you know Graham and I are in a tough spot. We just need a little help. Maybe you could sell a few of the things Grandma left you? That ring, perhaps, or the bonds. You don't even wear the ring, and it could make such a difference." I nodded slowly, hiding my disgust. "I'll think about it," I murmured, pulling out my phone later that night to jot down exactly what she had said. Every word, every request, I kept a record. The weeks went on, and the requests grew bolder. Graham called, suggesting I transfer part of the savings to keep it safe with him. Cassidy hinted at me signing papers that would make things easier if the land was ever sold. Each time, I acted hesitant, unsure, even vulnerable. I let them think they were wearing me down. Behind the scenes, I kept careful track. Every text, every voicemail, every awkward meeting scribbled into a notebook. They thought they were manipulating me, but really, they were giving me everything I needed to see just how deep their greed ran. It was almost unsettling to watch. The same sister who once couldn't look at me without bitterness was now leaning in close, touching my hand, calling me dear. Graham, who hadn't defended me that night, spoke with forced warmth, as though we were old friends. I let them believe it. I let them think they were winning. And all the while, I built a quiet case of their lies, their pressure, their manipulation. If they wanted to test me, they were about to learn just how patient I could be. It all came to a head on a rainy afternoon. Cassidy had invited me over again, her tone sharper this time, less friendly and more insistent. Graham was already seated at the dining table when I arrived, a stack of papers laid neatly in front of him. His smile was thin, strained, like a man desperate to close a deal. "Marin," Cassidy began as soon as I sat down, "we've been patient. We've tried to explain, but you're dragging your feet. We need you to do the right thing." She slid the papers across the table. "This is simple. You sign these, and we take care of everything. It's what family is supposed to do, help each other." I looked at the documents, already knowing what they were. A transfer, plain as day. They wanted control of the land Grandma had left me, the bonds too. It wasn't a suggestion anymore. It was pressure. Cassidy's eyes burned into me, daring me to resist. For a long moment, I didn't speak. I let the silence stretch, watching their impatience grow. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. Calmly, I set it on the table and opened it. Inside was a neat stack of printed messages, texts, emails, and notes from every conversation we'd had. Cassidy frowned. "What's this?" I slid one of the pages toward her. "This," I said quietly, "is every word you've sent me, every request, every attempt to corner me into handing over what Grandma left me. I thought you should see how it looks written down." Her face shifted, the fake warmth draining away in an instant. Graham leaned forward, skimming the page, his color fading as he realized how much I had kept. "I've been patient," I continued, my voice steady. "I let you talk, let you push, let you believe I was considering it. But I was never going to sign anything. Grandma trusted me, and I won't dishonor her by giving away what she left in my care." Cassidy's hands curled into fists. "You've betrayed me," she snapped, her voice cracking with fury. "You've been plotting this whole time, twisting my words, making me look like a monster." Her outburst might have once made me flinch, might have once sent me shrinking back. But not anymore. I sat still, calm, and met her glare with steady eyes. "I didn't twist anything. These are your words, your actions. You did this to yourself." The room went silent except for the rain tapping against the windows. Graham rubbed at his temple, muttering something under his breath, while Cassidy shook with rage. She wanted me to crumble, to second-guess myself. Instead, I stayed rooted, stronger than I had ever been. For the first time, it wasn't me who looked small at that table. It was her. And no amount of shouting could change the fact that I had been one step ahead the entire time. It didn't take long for the truth to spread. I hadn't planned on sharing the details with anyone, but my aunt, the same one who had first told me about Cassidy's resentment, asked me what had really been going on. I trusted her, so I showed her the folder, the texts, the emails, the notes I had kept. She read through them slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line, shaking her head as the weight of it sank in. "You need to tell your parents," she said firmly. "They should know what she's been doing." Part of me hesitated. For months, my parents had said nothing, sitting silently while Cassidy humiliated. But another part of me knew it was time. I wasn't the one who should carry the shame anymore. So the next weekend, I drove to their house and laid everything out on the kitchen table, just like I had with Cassidy. The room was quiet as my mother picked up the pages, her hands trembling slightly. My father leaned over her shoulder, his brow furrowed deeper with every line he read. By the time they finished, the silence was thick with something new, anger, but not directed at me. "She lied to us," my mother whispered, more to herself than to me. "She made us believe you were the problem." My father shook his head slowly, his jaw tight. All this time, and she sat there, letting us think she was the victim. It was as if a curtain had been pulled back, and they finally saw what had been in front of them all along. For the first time, they didn't defend her. They didn't excuse her. They looked at me with regret in their eyes, and I knew they understood the weight of their silence that night at the dinner table. Word moved quickly through the rest of the family. Cousins, uncles, aunts. Everyone heard about the scheme, the pressure, the way Cassidy had chosen humiliation over honesty. She tried to defend herself at first, claiming I had twisted things, but the written proof spoke louder than her voice ever could. And while her family's trust crumbled, so did her marriage. Graham's debts only grew worse, and with the weight of scandal hanging over them, the cracks in their relationship widened. Within months, he filed for separation. I heard through a cousin that he had moved out, leaving Cassidy alone in that big house she had been so desperate to show off. The image of her standing proud at the head of the dinner table was gone. Now she was the subject of whispers, her name spoken with pity and disappointment. The house that once held laughter during her parties stood quiet, the driveway empty more often than not. I didn't celebrate her downfall, but I didn't mourn it either. Cassidy had built her world on bitterness and greed, and when it collapsed, she had no one left to blame but herself. For the first time in years, the weight on my chest felt lighter. She had wanted me gone from her life, and now, she was the one left standing in the ruins of her own making. Life became quiet, and for the first time in a long while, I welcomed that quiet. I stopped waiting for apologies that would never come, stopped looking for cracks in other people's faces to see if they believed me or doubted me. Instead, I poured my energy into building something steady, something mine. The inheritance wasn't enormous, but it was enough to give me security. I paid off my small debts, bought reliable furniture, and fixed up the little apartment I had once seen as temporary. I planted herbs on the windowsill, bought a second-hand armchair, and turned my space into a home. Every night when I came back from work, I felt a calm that money couldn't buy. I worked hard, saved steadily, and made plans for the future. Nothing extravagant, just goals that made me feel grounded. A newer car when the old one finally gave out. A trip to the coast when I could take a few days off. Little by little, life felt fuller, not because of things, but because of peace. I never called Cassidy, and she never called me. Sometimes I'd hear updates through my aunt or cousin. They'd mention her name in hushed tones, talk about the parties that had stopped, the separation papers Graham had filed, the way the big house seemed too empty now. I never asked for details. I didn't need to. There was a strange satisfaction in knowing that the house she had once defended like a fortress, the place she had thrown me out of with water dripping down my face, was now her cage. She had wanted to stand taller by pushing me down, but in the end, she was the one left standing alone, her pride turning into walls around her. I didn't gloat, didn't shout, didn't spread her story further than it already had spread on its own. I simply lived. And that, I realized, was the most powerful answer I could give her. She had wanted me broken. Instead, I was stronger. She had wanted me erased. Instead, I had carved out a life without her. Sometimes at night, when I pulled Grandma's quilt over me, I thought of how different things might have been if Cassidy had chosen love over resentment, honesty over humiliation. We could have shared those dinners, shared those memories, shared the weight of family. But she had made her choice, and I had made mine. I didn't forgive her, but I also didn't let her consume me anymore. The anger that once kept me awake at night had cooled into something sharper, calmer, a quiet resolve. Looking back, I understood something I hadn't before. Revenge doesn't always come with shouting or destruction. Sometimes it's simply living better, living free, while the one who hurt you drowns in the weight of their own choices. Cassidy poured water over my head to push me out of her life. In the end, the only thing washed away that night was the last bit of power she ever had over me.